Chapter 3. In great haste, Mademoiselle Nadine and I began our journey back to Bavaria. At every station, soldiers boarded the train. They were so young, laughing and singing gay songs, flowers in their caps. I was shocked that they could seem so happy on their way to war, perhaps to death. When we reached the terminal station at Munich, my father, looking very worried, was there on the platform to meet us. He had been made commanding general in Munich. How swiftly things changed! No longer was there the gay, carefree life in the Bavarian capital. My mother was occupied with charity and war work, and the burden of the tremendous responsibility absorbed all my father's time. We scarcely saw him. Months passed while I concentrated on my studies, and my joy and consolation was my music. The news of friends dead or wounded came almost daily. After the first burst of victory, the war years ended in disaster and famine. The news of one defeat after another seemed to take the heart out of my father. He himself had to fight hunger and demoralization in Munich. His cares weighed on him heavily, and he began to show his years. During all this period, we had not been able to go to our castle of Thann. My father could not leave Munich, and my mother did not wish to go to Thann without him. Perhaps it was the fact that I was growing up that made me suffer so intensely over the war. I brooded over all the tragic happenings. I was 16, no longer a child and not yet an adult. I even lost interest in my music. My mother decided in the summer of 1917 to take me to Thann. She and my father were sure that in the surroundings which I loved so dearly, I would throw off my deep feeling of depression. But when I reached Thann, everything had changed. Or was it I who had changed? The excitement and exuberance with which I had always arrived were not there. To me, the castle seemed sombre and foreboding. The place had been understaffed because of the war, and even my garden looked desolate and neglected. My mother was occupied in the small town of Thann, just as she had been in Munich, with sewing for the wounded and other charity work. This meant that I was very much alone. I read a great deal and, accompanied by my little dog, took long walks through the woods. It seemed that there was no escaping the black-edged letters which told of death. They even followed us to Thann. I felt the suffering and tragedy of war intensely and personally. Thann did not have the uplifting effect on me, mentally or physically, which my parents had hoped. One morning my mother said with a forced brightness, "I've been neglecting you, dear. Let's drive to Weimar for a few days. You can see the homes of Goethe and Schiller." So we drove to Weimar. One almost forgot about the horror of war in Goethe's garden house, surrounded with flowers. Within its enclosure, one felt a nearness to its great owner, a nearness to his wonderful peace of mind. It was just the right place for my mother to have taken me. We visited Goethe's townhouse, the Ducal Palace, and Schiller's quarters. As we crossed the Ducal Gardens to our small hotel, I felt actually happy for the first time in many months. I was tired and decided to rest before dinner. When I began to undress, I discovered that a small picture of my father, which for years I had carried on my person, was missing. I searched everywhere for it, but it was gone. "Oh God," I cried, "Mama, something must have happened to Papa." My mother tried to convince me that the loss of the picture could have nothing to do with my father's well-being. But the following day, when we returned to Thann, there was a telegram waiting. "General seriously ill. Come at once." We rushed to Munich and found my father in the hospital. He was gravely ill, and it nearly broke my heart to see him so white, so suddenly old, lying there in his pillows. God was kind to him, for he was too ill to know of the tragedy which came to his country. Revolution swept Germany, and the king and queen were forced to leave Bavaria. Later, the situation became desperate when Kurt Eisner, a leader of the radical wing of the Social Democrats, proclaimed Bavaria a republic. On November 10th, Kaiser Wilhelm crossed over the border into exile in Holland. There were rumours that an attempt had been made against the Eisner regime, planned by a small navy group. One of the plotters against Eisner was a young naval officer, Baron Guttenberg. I listened avidly to the stories as they were told to my mother. The plot was discovered, and young Guttenberg was put in jail, cell 46 of the Munich police headquarters, but he succeeded in breaking out. He went to the hotel where his mother was staying, climbing in through a rear window. There he changed his clothes and, feeling safe in disguise, left the hotel by the front lobby. The elevator boy recognized him and gave the alarm. There was a wild chase through the streets. Communist guards followed by a fast-growing mob. Suddenly, young Guttenberg remembered a ruse which he had read about in some story, stepped into a doorway until the mob had caught up with him. Then he joined it, crying at the top of his voice, "Catch him! Catch him!" After a few blocks, he quietly dropped out of the chase and made his way out of Munich. He afterward joined an anti-communist group of officers in the northern part of Bavaria. The climax of the Eisner regime was the successful attempt on his life by Count Anthony Arco, who shot Eisner at the entrance of the Parliament House. Eisner was dead, but courageous young Arco was badly wounded and in prison. After Eisner's death, the communist Spartacist regime, which took over the government, was far more dangerous and ruthless than the one which had preceded it. The Spartacists were blood brothers of the Russian communists. They set out to abolish the intelligentsia as well as to wipe out the upper class. But their primary aim was to destroy the Christian faith. They also hoped, through the abolition of all private ownership of property, to hasten the day of the communist utopia. Under a Bavarian Soviet dictatorship, terror reigned in Munich. At last, it seemed as if the horror of my dreams had become reality. People were murdered in the streets, and many of our close friends were captured and shot in some filthy backyard or barracks. At the outbreak of this reign of terror, my father was brought home from his long stay in the hospital. It was thought that he would be far safer. Soon after his arrival, a communist mob broke into our home and forced their way to his room, determined to take him away to prison. At the sight of the poor man, who was unconscious and obviously dying, they left. They did no damage, nor did they question my mother or me. This did not lessen our anxiety. We were sure that we had only a temporary respite. No one knew what the next hour would bring. Everywhere there was lawlessness, murder, and terror. The whole atmosphere in Munich was one of paralyzing fear. Early one morning we heard the muffled sound of gunfire. It was like the rumble of distant thunder. News was brought to us that the communists had erected barricades in the streets. But against whom, no one knew. For 2 days the gunfire continued, but there was nothing to do but wait through the endless, agonizing hours of uncertainty. We remained in my father's room. He was helpless and unable to protect us, but we felt safer with him. All of the blinds and draperies in the house were drawn across the windows, as if it were continuous night. On the first day of May, the sound of church bells ringing joyfully burst upon our ears. The windows were thrown open, and it was like a miracle, for spring had come, and the air was filled with sunshine and warmth, and the city was rejoicing. Munich, we soon learned, were in the hands of the White Army, a group of anti-communist men, mostly former officers of the Army and Navy. These men had banded themselves together and, although a comparatively small fighting force, had succeeded in freeing Munich from the Reds. For the first time in many weeks, we dared to leave the house. My mother and I went out into the warm spring sunshine and walked, almost ran, through the streets of Munich. I shall never forget the emotion or the joy in the faces of the people as they saw the blue and white flag of Bavaria replace the red flag of communism. Soon flags seemed to be flying from every house. The very air was filled with hope and freedom. When we returned home, we found our friend, Colonel Baron Franz Gagern, anxiously waiting for us. We gasped as we stared at him in astonishment. He was dressed in an old army uniform. There were 2 pistols stuck into a wide leather belt which circled his ample waist. A white cockade was on his cap, set at a jaunty angle, and in his hand he held a most remarkable-looking medieval war club. We learned later that the club had been given to him by the abbot of the Benedictine monastery, which he and his White Army had liberated. I threw my arms around Baron Gagern and hugged him, while my mother laughed herself to tears. "Well," the colonel said gruffly, "I'm glad that you can laugh, even if it's at my expense. I've been worried for fear terrible things might have happened to you. Thank God you are safe. And you, Elizabeth, why, you've become a young lady since I last saw you." He told us briefly that he was leader of the White Army's avant-garde. He inquired for my father and other members of the family who had fortunately escaped death. We felt safe with Uncle Gagern in Munich. "I can't stay long," he said. "My best young officer is coming to meet me here. We have a date for lunch." He winked at me and added with his usual drollery, "After so many days of fighting, we have a great appetite." He was interrupted when a servant announced, "Baron Gagern, there is a young naval officer asking for you." "That must be Guttenberg. He is early." "Is that the Baron Enoch Guttenberg of the Eisner plot?" I asked in great excitement. "It is," Uncle Gagern replied, but before he had time to say more, the young man entered the room. He too was dressed in a most astonishing combination of clothes. He wore a blue navy jacket over grey civilian riding breeches, and on his feet were high brown riding boots. He also had 2 pistols stuck into a leather belt around his waist, and a white cockade in his cap. Uncle Gagern introduced him to my mother, and I watched the young baron as he touched her fingers to his lips. He apologized to my mother for his appearance. I thought that he looked wonderful. There was an easy grace about him, and even in his strange clothes he looked distinguished. When he was introduced to me, he turned and bowed. I had never seen a handsomer man. To me, he looked every inch the conqueror. I felt my cheeks burn as Uncle Gagern explained, "These are the dear ones whom I particularly fought to save." Enoch Guttenberg looked at me steadily for a moment, and I could see the depth of his grey eyes. I can well understand why. Then he turned away and added with a laugh, "But weren't there a few other reasons for our little war?" He sat down and for an hour told my mother how Franz Gagern had led the avant-garde against the communists, and how heroically Franz had inspired his men. It seemed absolutely fantastic to learn that this avant-garde had fought their way into Munich on horseback. Enoch Guttenberg also told of the death of several of his close friends, and he seemed to be deeply moved in speaking of them. I sat watching the fine, sensitive hands of this young man as he spoke. The 3 of them seemed to have entirely forgotten me. Finally, Uncle Gagern interrupted. "Come, Enoch, we must be going. It will be your fault if we have missed our lunch." I told you just to ring the bell." Uncle Gauguin seemed to be a little cross. "We would have been on time if you hadn't been so curious." Enoch Guttenberg rose and took my mother's hand. For the pleasure of this visit, I would be willing to miss a dozen lunches. Uncle Gauguin suddenly remembered me across the room and waved. Baron Guttenberg bowed, and they were gone. I wanted to run to the window, but restrained myself from doing so childish a thing. Instead, I sat down and tried to remember every word of the conversation. I wondered if I would ever again see this young Baron Guttenberg. The very next day he came to pay his respects to my mother, this time dressed in his correct navy uniform. I was asked to come to the drawing-room, but he did not seem even to acknowledge that I existed. I sat unobtrusively listening while he and my mother discussed a wide range of subjects. He made no effort at all to draw me into the conversation. When he did at last address one question to me, I felt my face flush miserably as I stumbled over an answer. He would think me the dullest of fools. When I had heard that he was in the drawing-room, I had put on what I thought was my most becoming dress, but as I sat there opposite him, I felt that it was far from fashionable. It was too long. In fact, I was sure that I looked drab. Several times this young man came to see my mother, and each time the harder I tried to make myself attractive, the more unhappy I felt. He was extremely polite, but he wasted neither words nor glances on me. I was miserable. "Don't be a little fool and fall in love with this young man," I warned my heart. "He scarcely knows that you exist. He is at least 10 years older than you. To him you are a child." Warnings were useless. I was desperately in love. I could not eat. I did not wish to leave the house, even for a walk, fearing that I might miss seeing him if he came to call on my mother. It was about 2 weeks after his first visit that I received an invitation from Enoch Guttenberg's sister, Countess Stauenberg, to have tea with her. I found Elizabeth Stauenberg a person of grace and charm. She was tall and slender, and her smile reminded me of the Mona Lisa. Every word and gesture expressed her inward beauty. I loved her at first sight. After we had talked for half an hour, she took me to the nursery to see her 2 children. Marie Gabrielle was a graceful, fair-haired child of 5, and Karl Berthold, a beautiful little boy of 15 months. We afterward had our tea in the drawing-room, and then she excused herself. I was speechless with fright when into the room walked Enoch Guttenberg. He sat down opposite me and began asking me questions. At the end of 2 hours, I was on the point of tears. By that time he knew all that there was to know about me. My childhood, the days at Tarn, my life in Munich, religion, music, art, even my hopes, my dreams, and my ideals. The conversation had actually taken the form of a serious examination. It was dark when I reached home, and in a very strange state of mind, I went directly to my mother. Enoch Guttenberg was there, I told her. He asked me questions about everything imaginable. He knows absolutely everything that there is to know about me. How stupid I was to tell him. I began to cry. "I love him, Mama, and now I'll never see him again. I'm so unhappy that I want to die." "Don't feel too upset, dear," my mother said very gently. "He would not have taken the trouble to ask you so many questions if he didn't like you. Go to bed, dear. After a good rest, you'll feel better." I ran to my room, trying to fight back the tears. I had never been so miserable. Why, oh why, I kept accusing myself, had I been so naive as to permit this man to find out all there was to know about me? I was just getting into bed when Gretchen, my mother's very dignified lady's maid, rushed into the room. "Young Baron Guttenberg is in the drawing-room talking to your mother. He came with a mountain of red carnations. I think all the carnations in Munich. Never in all my life was I so quickly dressed. Gretchen, dear, this one time, be good and bring me a bottle of Mamma's best perfume. Without hesitation, Gretchen hurried to my mother's room and returned with a precious bottle. From my trembling hand it slipped to my dressing table and broke, the pungent fragrance pouring into my lap. I quickly changed my dress, but the aura of perfume still clung to me. I sat down at my dressing table, trembling so that my teeth chattered. I could not go to the drawing room unless my mother sent for me. My eyes stared at the hands of a small clock as I sat waiting. How the minutes dragged! It seemed to me that I had been sitting there for an hour when my mother came quickly into the room and kissed me on the forehead. She was so excited she did not even notice that I was bathed in her favourite perfume. "Go down to the drawing-room, darling," was all that she said. I moved down the corridor, literally floating on a cloud of perfume. When I reached the drawing-room door, I hesitated. Enoch Guttenberg was standing in the centre of the room. When he saw me, all he said was, "Elizabeth," and he held out his arms. "Elizabeth, your mother," said yes. An hour later, when Enoch had gone, I again sat at my dressing table, staring at myself in the mirror. I still could not believe what had happened in that hour. I was sure that it had been a dream, and that at any moment I would awaken. After all my weeks of anxiety, I was actually going to marry this wonderful young George Enoch Guttenberg. I recalled over and over every word he had spoken, every look, every gesture. He had been so serious when he had said, "You know, Elizabeth, I'm afraid that it won't be easy for you, being my wife. The devils are loose all around us, and we, you and I together, will have to fight them. You will have to hold the stirrup for many a ride." I did not realize at the time that he was speaking not only of his recent ride into Munich, but also referring to an old saying, "For every man who rides, someone must hold the stirrup. Someone must stay behind to wait and hope and pray." I did not dream then how often holding the stirrup would be my part, so symbolic of our life together. All that I knew on that happy day of our engagement was that hold the stirrup I would. There was nothing I would not do for my love.